Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ultra MK Podcast, where together we are reversing the narrative. And on today's show, we have a returning guest, a gentleman who is a California native. He is a Navy veteran. He actually was an HS-4 Black Knight, and he is an author of a recent book published called Lucifer Zenith. He's a California gubernatorial candidate, and I'm so glad that he has joined us on today's show.
That is our obligation, to inform and alert the American people, to make certain that they possess all the facts that they need and understand them as well, the perils, the prospects, the purposes of our program, and the choices that we face.
Daniel Mercuri, how's it going, my friend?
It's going good. Tough too. It's been a very long and interesting journey. Tiresome for sure. Definitely weighs on the spirit. But it's also been eye opener as time goes on with the campaign and how long I've campaigned and the amount of people that I've met and the cities that I've been to, the people I've spoken with, and just hearing the tremendous support as well as the redress and grievances and the emotional roller coasters that people are going through in their state with what they're having to deal with. So it's been a wild ride, for to say the least.
Yeah, and for viewers or listeners of this podcast that maybe haven't um, seen Daniel Mercury on a previous podcast, we dug into his biography a little bit about how long he's been running, and just this morning he confirms that he's been running political races for just over 6.5 years. And so, can you just kind of bring us up to speed with how you decided to just throw your hat in the ring for the gubernatorial race? And this is for the second time, right? You ran
Third,
and this is the third time.
yeah.
Okay, so you're definitely committed, and you're trying to definitely make a change in the state of California.
Well, I mean, I think for me, it was more about, doing what I needed to do that I felt was, in good conscience. Once I realized how deep the corruption went, I couldn't just, like I said, in good conscience, do nothing with the information that I discovered, how the corruption works, where corrupt government hides and operates, what laws they use to facilitate that corruption. And for me, it didn't sit well for me to just simply walk away after I ran in the 25th district at the special election when Katie Hill, stepped down. And I had actually learned that she was gonna step down from one of her staff members when I called my local office, and they were already packing up months before she had made her announcement. So I kind of had a head start on in running in that race, and I think it was just the things that I was saying, where I was just speaking the truth. And I was just, trying to say, the things that I wanted to hear, because as somebody who lives in this district and in this state, I wanted answers too. But once I sort of discovered how unions sort of infiltrate and how there's a lot of individuals, lobbyists and corporatists, and how the laws are written and why they're written, it begged the question why these individuals that are representatives, how they get away with what they're doing. Why is everything falling on deaf ears? So I knew after that race, I immediately threw my hat into the ring for the 2022. But it just so happened that the 2021 recall took off. So I had already been campaigning. So I just immediately threw my hat in that ring, and I made the ballot for the recall. And once that race ended, well, I was still going on, and Gavin Newsom retained his seat. I was still set out for the 2022. So it just rolled right into it. And once I didn't make it into the general in 2022, for me, uh, I knew I had to keep going. And so, because I continued to learn more and I continued to see more of the corruption. And that's when, for me, I just said, I just prayed heavily about it, and I just kept hearing God telling me to finish the race. And so now I made my declaration in 2022 for the 2026, and I haven't really had a month off. I've always had anywhere from one to, 7 events. In the early stages, it was like 1 to 3 events a month. Then it became like 1 to 5. And then it was like 1 to 7, and it just kept growing. So now it's, and it's gotten to a point too where I don't, people call me, I don't really call them. My team tries to strategically make phone calls to certain groups so that I can speak to. But for the most part, we get pretty steady invites. And so much so that I've had to cancel a couple weeks and say I need a break.
Yeah. I'm sure you've been traveling from top to bottom in the state of California for a long time
I
now.
have.
So,
I've been to, yeah, I've been to over 242 cities. I've been to all 58 counties. I've been as high as north as Siskiyou and as down south as San Diego. So, yeah, and everywhere in between.
so in California, do you find that most counties are still using voting machines?
They are. First, the state uses 5 approved different types of voting machines. So it's not just Dominion. The Dominion is the primary voting machine that California uses, or that most counties use, except for Shasta. Shasta actually got away from that. And it begs the question, why aren't the other counties kind of following in line with Shasta when their constituents of that county are screaming to get rid of the machines? Because they're hackable. Dr. Frank Douglas, I think it is, or Douglas
Doug Frank.
Frank.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I've spoken with him many times, and he's a great guy. And he's proven it multiple times that, our machines are hackable. They're ballot harvesting. And then, of course, there's no way for us to really tell that the company isn't, trying to infiltrate, or they're, you know, um, playing around with the numbers. And we can't really verify too much of that because of the fact that the state only allows for 1% of the investigation to take place. So so 1%, that's nothing, So there would have to be, it begs the question, if it's, are they only letting you see a portion of, a sector of the county that they know is, looks good. And so the numbers look great. There doesn't seem to be any foul play. Or are they going to let you see a side of the area where everyone's complaining about? Because, for instance, some of the precincts don't actually have the list of names of all the candidates. So back in the recall, I was getting phone calls, as including a lot of the other candidates, which we all could have probably should have probably sued the state, but a lot of us were just really heartbroken because of the corruption, where people were calling me and they were visually showing me, from their phone, if they could FaceTime me, and they were showing me, look, your name is not on the machine. So they would go to whoever was in charge at that voting precinct and they would say, where's my candidate's not on here? So they were told, well, vote for another candidate. Like,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
every other candidate was enduring that too. I was, again, a lot of the candidates talk to each other. We have each other's phone numbers. I talked to Ryan Tillman, I've talked to David Serpa, Kobe Markham, even some of the Democrats, like, we're not all enemies. We do generally try to support each other. We get that this is a very tough arena. And, we kind of come together and, we speak, we kind of, coke and joke about things that we all sort of endure. Um, and then we'd call each other and say, hey, are you enduring the same issue? Is your name on some of the machines or not on the machines? Or are people not able to vote for you because you're just not there? This is a problem. And did the SOS do anything about it? Was there any investigations? No. So,
You, you know,
it begs the
I
question,
think,
why do we have these machines?
well, I was recently in Southern California and I spent some time with journalist Lara Logan. And she recently did an episode on her show Going Rogue with Lara Logan. I think it was episode number 45, called Stolen Elections, with two gentlemen, Gary Bernstein and Ralph Pizzulo. I encourage people to go check out that episode because they talk about what's happening today in Venezuela and how there's multiple reasons why President Trump is deploying our military down to Venezuela. And it isn't just for regime change. They've been involved in the elections and the voting machines specifically in the United States. And I feel that that could be another reason why we're sending our people down in there to to get rid of some of either the servers or some of the data centers or places where they're manipulating elections. And call me conspiracy theorist all you want, but I still feel that 2020 was not, and multiple elections, but definitely 2020 was not a fair election. And I think Los Angeles County in particular, I know for sure they use Smartmatic machines
Yeah.
and all these other densely blue metropolitan counties, they're definitely still using voting machines. So it's like I think the people need to wake up to these things are hackable and they can be controllable to get the outcome that is not the will of the people, not the voice of the people. So
No, no, I've encouraged people quite a bit extensively too, and it's even on my website where it says integrity elections on one of the drop downs, and you can read a little bit about the history and what people can do locally. And I've always encouraged people how to hold their county clerk registrar's office and their representative, the county clerk, to hold them accountable and what you can do to ensure that at least in part they know they're being watched. And people just right now I don't understand why people aren't focused on that, because it's one thing to have your candidate of choice. It's another issue to not involve yourself at the local level to ensure that your county clerk, um, is doing exactly what they're supposed to do. With one, the state has protocols to ensure fair elections. Two, they have to understand the state constitution, and they have to know that every ballot has to be counted. They cannot close the voting precincts, and they can't make an announcement until everyone's done voting, and yet they do. And this is where your county clerk can slow things down, and this is where your county clerk registrar's office, can also be held accountable in the sense that some of these county clerks here in the state of California are voted in by the people, right? They're the easiest to remove because everybody does down ballot voting or not at all. Some of them are appointed, yeah, but we have 58 counties. So figure it out which county you're in and whether or not your representative, your county clerk, is actually held accountable. And then they need to publicize publicly what are they going to do when there's foul play, when somebody comes in and says somebody voted in my stead, and here I'm standing, and yet it's saying that I already voted. The machine should be immediately shut down at that very moment. There has to be, every county has to follow a state protocol, but they can also have their own protocols as to what they're going to do. And if they publicize it, well, now they can be held even more accountable. Um, you know, um, Personally, right? They can be personally held liable. So why aren't we going down these pathways, right? And why aren't we demanding our local county clerk registrar to purge the voter rolls? You can do this locally. You don't have to wait for the SOS or get an approval and get it on a ballot. Locally, they can do this. They don't need to wait for the state. And when you purge the voter rolls, it'll force everybody in the county to have to come back in and re-register, because then that eliminates dead people. That eliminates people getting multiple ballots. It eliminates people who are out of state still getting a ballot. It removes illegal aliens. Why aren't we doing this? So again, the big why, and people really involving themselves could really take back their state if they just focused on the county clerk and their vested authorities. I don't
and that's
understand why we're not.
and Daniel, is that the path that Shasta County took with their voting systems? Is they address the county clerk of Shasta County?
They did. And of course, again, you've got the board of supervisors, and sometimes you have you have a board, a business operator, somebody who actually kind of oversees. Again, there's sometimes a little layers depending on the county. So, but the point is that yes, you would focus predominantly on, well, the board of supervisors would, on the county clerk. And the county clerk also has enough authority too to sort of oversee certain things.
Mhm.
Also the contracts that come with the machines. If they've got a database of corruption, which most of them do, but they don't say anything, because, well, they're in favor of this woke ideology. They want to overthrow or overtake, because they want to keep the state blue. So again, we have a lot of people who are just cheating the system. So it's important. And a lot of the people in Shasta County, kept hammering their board of supervisors, and eventually they that's what they're there for. They're there to secure the rights, not just the rights of the people, but the will of the people. What do the people want? So there's a balance there. And this is how you have to have somebody who understands what it means to engage in good governance. And they did. They succeeded. I don't see why other counties aren't doing this. Um, but here we stand.
Well, it seems too like, if you want to call it the deep state, if the deep state is sort of like take for example Tina Peters in the state of California. She was the Mesa County clerk for that county, and she had backed up information on a thumb drive. And since then, they've used some crazy state laws to indict her and put her into a prison, in a Colorado State prison,
Yeah.
kind of making her like setting the example for like if you fall out of line, or if don't you know
Yeah, if you
if
don't
you
play ball, we're gonna make an
if you don't play
example of you.
ball, yeah, we're going to make an example out of you. So, I mean, it seems like they could be doing a little of that as well, right? In
Yeah.
California.
Yeah, and a lot of people are afraid of government because they don't know the laws. That's the other thing too. I always tell people, you need to know the laws. You really do. You need to know the highest authority of the state. You may not be able to understand your state codes and statutory codes and regulations and city ordinances. I get it. But you've got two very big important manuals that oversee all of those code policies and regulations, and that is the Constitution and the state constitution. And you have to ensure that wherever the state constitution is out of agreement, then it's null and void. It doesn't apply. And you have to know how to use it. And this is the part that people don't know. I mean, people are like, how do you know so much? I just read. That's it. It's not like I'm some, savant or genius. I just, anytime an issue comes up, I go back to those first two, documents and, read the Declaration of Independence and see where everything is in alignment. It's easy to see. That's why our forefathers wrote, we know these truths to be self-evident, right? It's obvious to see when something is in agreement, right? 2 plus 2 is not 22. It's just basic, simple information. And when you know things are in alignment, then you know that the law is positive law. And you don't
Is
need to
it
be a
though?
lawyer. You just
Do do you think people get kind of confused between the federal constitution, the federal laws versus the state constitution and state laws? Because I mean, isn't each state holding their own elections, and then that would fall within state jurisdiction, or does it matter which election is happening?
So federal can only affect the state so much, right? Again, when we talk about state federal issues, why is there separation? It's because we're part of a nation state, right? And we joined the union. So we're not really, if you look at your nationality, you're not really an American. It's actually not listed in some of our title United States codes. What is listed that if you whatever state you're living in, that's your nationality. So you're Californian, right? You're Coloradonian, you're Hawaiian, right? That's actually your nationality. Those are listed, right? But we consider ourselves, well, as a union, we're Americans. We're united, the United States of America, and every state has their own state constitution because culturally, every state is different. The issues that they deal with are different. So, Tennessee is not going to have the same issues as California. Here we deal with earthquakes and fires and floods. Tennessee, deals with, high winds and tornadoes and so on. So, we don't have the same culture. We also have, larger major metropolitan areas with that cultural difference and in how we deal with family construct, education, and technology that also affects cultures. And, we live on the shores. Other people's deal with the mountains. You go to Alaska, the way they live is nowhere near the way some people do who live in Texas, in hotter environments and stuff. So culturally, every state has its own constitution, but the constitution at the state level has to be an agreement. That's why our forefathers wrote that, we've been endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them. Well, the word among means there's more. So states are designed to elaborate on among because there's more. So if you read the California State Constitution preamble and then you look at the first Article 1, Section 1, it's probably the most beautiful paragraph that harmonizes with the Constitution greatly, but it lists out more of that which is unalienable. And so this is why I tell people you really need to know it because, if you were going into battle, it's like saying your state constitution is your pistol, and your constitution is your rifle, right? So you really need to know those things.
Mhm. And so it just kind of brings me back to the question of like when it comes to elections and laws, are we falling onto the California laws for the election, or is it a federal situation at that point? With holding, our
Uh,
county clerks accountable.
for instance, the federal can say, and this is where it gets tricky because of the Ninth and Tenth Amendment. So the Ninth and Tenth Amendment, powers not delegated or the enumerated powers left up to the state and or its people, right? They were written somewhat in a vague way, purposely, and they did that on purpose because the Ninth and Tenth Amendment are the reasons why the Anti-Federalist Papers were the core reasons for the installments of the Ninth and Tenth, because the Federalist Papers really wanted to centralize the government, but our forefathers loathed the democracy and knew that a democracy would eventually shoot us into a monarch. In fact, they actually said that, and so the Ninth and Tenth allow the states to push back. So the states are there to say, wait a second, we don't necessarily agree with this because this is out of alignment. This is actually going to remove individual rights, because at the end of the day, the 10th Amendment says, it's left up to and or the people, right? So the first contract with, the government is we the people, right? And so, power, where does government derive their just powers? From the consent of the governed. Okay, so that's us. And so when you look at the 10th Amendment, it says that and or the people, it means the people have the final say. So we can push back on any law that's ever been drafted, whether it's federal or state. So when we look at our elections, federally they can be separated. So technically, in some part, the federal government can say, well, if you're in California, and it comes to a federal election, you can't count our ballots with your machines, right? So then a federal election would be separate, could be separated. Trump could do this. And again, it can get on the technical side, but generally we allow for the states to kind of handle that sort of business, because we don't expect states to cheat the way they're cheating. We don't expect them to do that, which is why the machines are so tumultuous to even have in the first place. And states can also say, well, this is a local election. Well, federal can't do anything about that, right? Because it's a local election, right? So if it's a county election or a special election, it has nothing to do with the federal government. Federal government's not going to do anything about it. They're not going to come in and do some sort of investigation because there was foul play, right? So this is where the state comes into play. That's why it's so important is that we understand this. So there can be a two separation, of laws, for federal and state, right? Generally, state is supposed to align with federal and should, but every once in a while they push back and they say no, for various reasons.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. I wanted to switch gears here a little bit and just talk more about things happening in the state of California. And something that a lot of Californians are constantly feeling day to day is like cost of living. And a lot of that is derived to just the cost of like energy in California.
Yeah.
And so I know that for a long time, California had its own oil refineries and would be, they wouldn't necessarily be exporting, but we'd be like self-contained uh, when it comes to fuel in our state. And so I know that they've been shutting down certain refineries for the last 25 years. And I think it's dwindled down from like 24 down to just 8, with 2 more closing here pretty soon in the new year. I think it's the next one in the chopping block is the Phillips 66 refinery in Wilmington. It's going to be closing in January of this upcoming year. They So they've been making 139,000 barrels uh, of refined fuel each day, and that one facility has 600 employees and 300 contractors. So those folks are going to be losing their jobs, and this it's a very robust refinery. They produce 1.3 billion gallons annually, and this is going to affect the state's supply by upwards to 17%, and that's according to Skip York, the chief energy strategist. What can you tell us about the agenda of the state of California when it comes to fuel energy, and how come it's becoming so expensive? Is this manufactured?
Yeah, it's definitely manufactured. I mean, when the state has its own natural resources, it's a violation of the California State Constitution when it talks about natural resources, water being one of them, right? So the state has a duty, your representative have duty to ensure that natural resources are to be used for the good of the state, right? So why are we not utilizing the natural resources? Oil is one of them, natural gas, and, water, all these things that we have going on here, is this is definitely on the government's part that is purposeful. So this is man-made, constructed on their part to force us into the Green New Deal. And the problem with that, though, is like we had the Ivanpah solar panel farm that spent over $2.2 billion. And of course, it had, Google, and had, it had another other like huge, tech companies that wanted to involve themselves in this sort of clandestine achievement, but it failed. In fact, they just shut it down in September of this year. It didn't work. So they cleared out, these environmentalists literally cleared out, this huge landway so that they could put out this farm. And they wanted to charge, these two major, basically giant batteries, and they would literally absorb the sun, and it would shoot out this light beam that would kill off roughly of 7,000 birds in mid-flight because of how hot those beams were. But it wasn't producing the energy that they thought it would produce, that our oil refinery produce, because it's, we use combustible, engines, and of course the nuclear power plants we have that they've shut down, and they, really forcing us to go green. So why are they forcing us into something that doesn't, it's not really tried and true? Right. The best way to use, like, I'm all for new technologies and green technologies. I'm all for, clean water and clean air. I get it. I'm in full support of that, but you can't do that without, you have to mitigate the issues at first at hand before you go big. You need a run down smaller scale. And we can just look at Texas. 2 years ago, they froze over because they all went Green New Deal. And so what did they end up going back to? They ended up, turning back on some of the refineries. They went back to natural gas. Why? Because, natural gas, again, generates its own heat. And so the engines that we need to function, some of our electronics require that heat and a protective measure so that they can get through those different sort of, weathers, at different atmospheric conditions. So here in the state of California, when it comes to our oil refineries, yeah, we have, idle wells and orphan wells that they have, plugged up and they've left there. And the problem with that, though, is they've pulled, for decades, the oil from the ground, and now it has, kind of like a siphon. Once you siphon fluid to go in one direction, you can't just put a cork on it. And well, that's what they do. And then what happens is that oil has to go somewhere. Well, because they've been pulling it up, sure, it won't come out of the spouts, but the problem is it'll seep out through the ground, outward. So it'll kill off the vegetation. So all these genius green, environmentalists are now going to kill off all the vegetation, and it'll spread out for miles, and who knows how much further, because it's just a guesstimate. So that vegetation, that greenery, that's all going to die, and it's going to poison the land. It can seep into the water. So rather than doing that, it's best to turn the pipelines back on and use current and new technologies that, can repair some of these older pipes. And also it will lower the energy costs for everybody here in the state of California. Our gas prices will drop back down to like $1, and we can compete globally. In fact, with, I think if they're operating at 7% capacity, like some of our oil pipelines that go out into the San Joaquin areas, you will notice that they generate over $300 billion in tax revenue for the state. So if the state can generate just from that alone, just from that industry, $300 billion a year, and they're only operating at 7% capacity roughly, imagine how much revenue the state would generate if we were operating at full capacity. Right. And we would be competing, not just nationwide, but we would be competing globally, with, other countries like Saudi Arabia, right? Where that's their primary gold is black gold. And this is why we know we have such corruption because, I think it was a year and a half ago. I don't know if anybody remembers, but when their gas went up by almost, quadrupled. So if I think I normally pay $70 for natural gas, with my stove and heating with the water. Well, it went up to almost $480. So, I remember calling the gas company going, wait a second, what happened here? And they had said, well, they had to import in natural gas because we shut down some of our natural gas refineries, and we had to import it in. But I also know that Gavin Newsom allowed for shell corporations to dig and engage in fracking, and then they sold it. And then not only did they sell that our natural gas, they had to sell it right back to us, only this time at a premium, which is why we paid so much because, well, people were needed the gas. Why? To heat up. That's why they want you to get off on gas stoves and heating up things, and they don't want you to use so much water. Again, this is all man-made crisis that our current government is creating, and yet we have the answers right in front of us. Desalination plants, we could have we could have dozens of them, and the ones that we do have, well, they don't. I think I spoke about this at the showdown, that uh, those power plants or
Desalination.
those
Yeah.
desalination plants, they require electricity. So we've shut down a massive amounts of power plants to generate the electricity that those desalination plants would require. And we would have plenty of fresh water. We'd never be without it. Why? Because we're right next to an ocean. So why aren't we using these things? Again, this is all an agenda that steers the market to go into a different enterprise, which is actually illegal. When you look at the Constitution, it's under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. That clause is known as the necessary proper clause, if I'm not mistaken. And it basically lists out 18 authoritative powers. Well, running the state like a business, or government engaging in some sort of enterprise, is actually illegal. It's not their purview. It's the open and fair and free market. They're just there to sort of regulate it, but they can't legislate it to steer it to go in any one direction that forces our hands to go green. I don't want an electric vehicle. I want a good old, gasoline
Give me a
driven, tried and
diesel.
true over the right, or even diesel, right? Why? Because these natural resources have already been proven to work. And when we go green with these batteries, well, to make those battery vehicles still require combustible engines in the manufacturers to generate and create those batteries. So it's kind of an oxymoron to generate the energy that we require that comes from fuel, but we want to go green because we want it to be all electrical, and the sun just doesn't give us enough power that we can absorb, to put it out there so that we can travel.
Well, I've been following other things too. Like there is a recent documentary put out called Climate Trails on Amazon Prime, and I encourage folks to go check that out because it seems as if our government and other private NGOs and companies are involved in geoengineering our skies. And
Yes.
and Bill Gates is actually involved in blocking out the sun, and they're
Yes.
manipulating weather. So the weather that we have is it's not organic. It's deemed to be it's fake, and there's data to prove it, and there's research to prove it, and that then can cause the forests to dry out and to become tinder boxes for wildfires, which we've seen for many years here in California. And when you have forest burning, and then you have towns burning down like the Palisades, can you imagine all the carbon and all the bad stuff that's burning, that's just being emitted into the oxygen? So, it is very contradictory. They contradict themselves all the time with policies that then in turn pollute the environment. And
No,
so,
you're exactly right. When you see the skies painted or chemtrailed, I would encourage people to, go wash your car on that day, right? And then
yeah.
let your car sit, and then scoop up what looks like a thin layer of dust, and you'll realize, and just take a magnet to it, and you'll see that the dust is not dust, it's aluminum, and it gets magnetized. Well, if they weren't spraying us, then it wouldn't actually have that sort of material in it. But that's exactly what they're doing, and that dries up the land. That causes vegetation to be easily ignited, burned up, in various ways. And then, yeah, we're breathing that in, and it destroys our crops, and the food that we eat is getting tainted. Like, how much more ways can they poison the people? And then if you look at the flight patterns of these aircrafts, I mean, again, it's public, and you can see the flight patterns, how they zigzag, right? Almost like a search
Hmm.
and rescue pattern that we used to have to do. It's called a ladder pattern. And that ladder pattern, you go up so far, you come back down so far, but you stay close to the pathway that you traveled when you first went east and west, then north and east, and so on, and back and forth. And you'll see no flight, regular, airlines do that. what are they doing? I mean, and of course, geoengineering goes back to Vietnam, at least as far as I know, and we were educated on it when I was in the military. That we thought that we could drown out the Viet Cong. We thought that we could drown out the enemy, but instead we actually negatively affected our own troops because they weren't familiar with that region of the world, that sort of tropical environment, and we made it worse. In Saudi Arabia, I think it was just last year, they ended up using weather modification to the point where they flooded the city. And it was like buildings were falling apart because they weren't prepared and their structures couldn't handle the amount of water that came down. And that was because they were cloud seeding. I mean, stop messing with the weather. Like
Yeah.
they're trying to be God, and they're screwing it up. And we, the people, suffer the consequences for their stupidity.
It's really refreshing to hear a candidate like yourself be willing to talk about these subjects because, I mean, let's face it, it's no longer conspiracy theory. There is weather modification patents. There's apps that people can use to, like you said, track the flight paths and the types of airlines that are doing these flight paths and who owns these airplanes and what they're involved in. And I know people have done the research now. So it's very refreshing to hear a candidate talk about these issues because, in years past, you'd be deemed a conspiracy theorist to even talk like that, and
Oh
people wouldn't
yeah,
even people
I
wouldn't even
even put
take you
a
seriously.
no, they wouldn't. And I even had somebody who even told me, isn't there something better for you to talk about back in the recall? I actually did it again. I did another video of it a few months back. But I said, I go look behind me, and you could see, you could see the planes just spitting out the chemtrail. And I said, you put me in office, this isn't going to happen anymore. I said, if anything, I'm going to use the Air National Guard, and we're going to track these people, and we're going to bring the media down, and we're going to, basically hold them at gunpoint because they're poisoning. It's an attack on the people, and expose exactly what they're spraying, who they are, who gave them the order, and if they choose not to comply, well, then I'm going to shoot them down. End of
Yeah,
story, right? And this is what we require from the governor. When we hear people, like I get it, make California, or not make California, but make America healthy again. So I don't understand why we're not you know you know we're not pushing that envelope to stop spraying our skies, right? And that
yeah.
really hasn't happened yet. It's still happening everywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. I like your method of and tactics of remedy. It seems like I heard another gubernatorial candidate, oh, it was Colonel Doc Pete Chambers in Texas, said something very similar. And that's what we need. We need some accountability, and we need to be able to do open investigations, figure out, who these people are, what their purpose is, who they work for, and figure out how to stop it because yeah, you could eat organic all you want or grow your own crops, your own garden, but if they're spraying the skies above it every day and it's trickling down on your food, that's a huge problem.
Well,
And
and
that
I'll and
ties
I'll
in.
say I'll say this about it too, and this is something too, and I don't have it in front of me, and I if I knew I would try to recall but we actually do have there is a federal law and there's state codes that actually permit for geoengineering. It actually says weather modification that is permitted. So why they deny it begs the question: if it's already law, then just say, well, it's law. We already have codes. It's permitted. We modify the weather for X, Y, and Z. But they know that they had to do something first as a formality, so then there can be no investigations in the sense as to saying something is being done illegally. It's not. It's actually being done legally. However, it was done out of the eyes of the agreement of the people. If the people knew publicly, right? But this is why you have to be involved legislatively because you have to know what are they passing, right? Well, our state in California, and I'm pretty sure it's pretty similar in other states, our legislative body drafts between 2 and 5,000 bills a year, and roughly 1,000 of those on average get signed into law. Well, that's not for your benefit. And a lot of that you're never going to read. And some of it, they gut other bills to put in something in there that might have to deal with weather modifications. CEQA, just alone, this, I think in 2024, had over 33 or 34 um, bills that modified it or updated it or added to it, and nobody knows about that, right? You can actually download the CEQA. it's a guideline, right? It's over 502 pages, right? How many people read CEQA, about what you can and can't do and what the local regions are supposed to adhere to. And then you can see what they've done to update it, to refine it, to make it more ironclad. And most people don't even realize it was actually Ronald Reagan. Governor Ronald Reagan was the one who actually implemented CEQA. So, again, I know people love Ronald Reagan, but he's actually the reasoning why Californians are dealing with so much stupidity. And then, of course, the president, some of the things with him and amnesty, the 1986 Vaccine Injury Act. I mean, he was the reasoning why we're dealing with what we're dealing with, pharmaceuticals having, complete, not amnesty, but they're immune from the laws. That's
Yeah.
illegal per the Constitution. How can you do that? And yet he was the one who did, and everybody goes, "Oh, I love Reagan." Do your
No.
homework.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why people need to wake up and stop being so partisan and just, wanting to vote for a party. I think you need to be more observant to what people's records are and what they've been involved in and
Yeah.
vote for the person. And is that something too that, I mean, I know at this point you're running as a Republican, but are you considering changing?
I am. I haven't made that decision yet. It's definitely something I've spoken to my team about. We talk about the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. I talk to Democrats. I'm not just out there. Like, I'm not a big fan of talking to an echo chamber. It's easy to talk and preach to the choir, people who share similar values, and you're trying to pine and win their vote. But, I've spoken, again, I've been to over 242 cities, and I've actually cycled back to a lot of the groups that I spoke to back during the recall. And many of them have not changed. I always ask the question, how many of you read the California State Constitution? And nobody raises their hand. So because people always ask me, Daniel, what makes you qualified to be governor? And I always ask the question in return. Candidates think that they can't, turn the questions around on the people who, they're coming to speak to. And absolutely, you should. And I always tell people, how many of you who've lived here your whole life? And almost every hand, in the room will go up. Most people have been here their whole life. And a lot of them, might be in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I said, okay, so how many of you read the California State Constitution? And again, nobody raises their hand. And I said, so what makes you think you're qualified to ask me if I'm qualified when you don't even know the laws of your own state and you've lived here your whole life? Right? Like, this is the ignorance. You're not asking me if I'm qualified. You're asking me what are my accolades that you think would justify what could correlate to me being a governor. And honestly, our forefathers never put that into the Constitution, right? They didn't put accolades. If they did, they would have written it in there. But they wanted men and women who had the willingness and the fortitude to stand up in the face of adversity, no matter the cost, even at the expense of their own life. And this is what they wanted: common sense, common men, common laws, right? Because this is really the laws of God have written in the hearts of men, and this is what we say common law is really the foundation to all of our statutes. So, as far as me leaving the party, we're thinking about it. We're not sure. There's a lot of thoughts that are going into it. It's a lot of planning, but it wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea because the NPP's nonpartisan party, right, are basically individuals who've left the parties and don't want anything to do with any party for that matter. They don't want to go green. Like, there's already like Green Party, Blue Party, there's Whig Party, there's Labor Party, there's the Patriot parties, there's the Green Party. There's so many parties that go back to the 1800s here in California. There's over 55 of them. So a lot of people have said, we'll start a new party. I'm not in favor of that because it's not a new concept. It's not a new idea. It's just another fraction to faction off, another group of patriots who really can't stand the Republican Party. All right. So, well, then just go NPP and just exactly what you said, focus on the nature of the character of the candidate, focus on their constitutional understanding, which would require you to also know the laws in the Constitution and the writings of our forefathers, and then make sure you're paying attention to any major red flags and inconsistencies, right? A lot of candidates out there contradict themselves. You have to pay attention closely to each candidate. And I have tons of videos that are out there. I'm very consistent in everything that I say. I've never once flip-flopped, as far as I'm concerned, on any subject matter that I've been out there. If anything, I've refined my answers and tightly when it comes to where I stand. And because I'm more, I understand the laws much more now than I did before. So for the most part, I think it's important that everybody focus on the nature of the character of the candidate and dismiss the party altogether. Because let's face it, the Republican Party has not flipped California red in the Senate for over 70 years. You can dig that up and it's in the public domain. They haven't flipped the assembly in over 55 plus years. That's also in the public domain. And it's easy to see really how many conservative gubernatorial, or governors have we had in California? Well, Ronald Reagan was really it, and even if you look at him, he used to be a Democrat before he transferred over and crossed over into the Republican side. So these are the things that I think people really need to understand. Stop listening to the party. And I was actually told by somebody when I asked the question, and I ask your listeners, is it better to vote for a compromised Republican if you're conservative or a Democrat? And the answer is neither. It's a trick question. Stop compromising. Stop saying, well, I think that person, I hear it all the time, well, I think this candidate's going to do an okay job. We just need a win. So you're so desperate in just trying to get a win that you're willing to rob Peter to pay Paul, and you're okay with getting a few carrots and crumbs on the table. I'm not. I'm not willing to get behind another candidate because people say, well, you don't have $1 million. Yeah, because I'm not willing to be bought out. I'm not willing to be a sellout because big donors comes big problems. Big donors aren't going to just give you money for free. The unions aren't going to just give it to you for nothing. There's always a string attached, and they're going to bring a contract into that, and you're bound to that. And it becomes an exploitation of the contract clause. I will not be bound to that. So I'm focusing on grassroots, and I'm focusing on in-kind donations, meaning if you want to give me the money, but you have a service, which I have. I've got a few billboards that are up, but those billboards are expensive. But instead, I got the in-kind donation to be on the billboards and got the endorsement from that company, right? So this is a good thing, and that would normally have costed maybe $150,000, for a couple months on just one side. And I have a couple of those. So, that kind of brings the money up as to how much money I've actually raised. So this is really why it's important that people pay attention to the candidate and not the party. And the NPPs here in California have grown by almost 1 million. So in other words, 1 million people in California have unregistered and re-registered as an NPP. What does that tell you? They're telling you they're tired of the party. And Democrats are too. I've spoken to Democrats. I've gone to Democrat NPP forums, and they don't care for this woke agenda, the attack on children, parental rights, the attack on parental rights, exuberant amount of property tax and fuel, and they're feeling the same pinch. And I always tell people you can't blame Orange Man for that because the Democrats have been in charge for roughly 80 years. Here in California at the Senate, and over almost 60 for the Assembly. Who's writing all the laws, right? The Democrats. The Republicans here in the state of California are absolutely inept. They have no authority. So you can't blame the Republicans. And this is the part where people stare at me with this, deer in the headlight look, and they go, "Really? Yeah, the Republicans can't pass anything." So you're looking at the Democrats, and they really don't they don't understand that. They think Donald Trump is the reasoning why everything sucks in California. I'm like, he can only affect the state so much. All right. It's really our current state legislative body that has really screwed over our state. And they've the ones who've been in charge. They've been a majority or super majority this entire time. So this is where the ignorance has come into play, and why our state is failing.
Which kind of leads me back to the road of elections, right? Because from my perspective, it feels like if we could somehow get a hold of our elections to make sure that this elected body isn't installed by any corrupt voting mechanisms, that the will of the people and the voice of the people can actually turn out to make changes and make positive change. Because I'm a firm believer in a balanced government where you have both sides of the spectrum coming together with shared ideas and being able to debate one another and come to common sense conclusion on how to write legislation and to how to implement laws in our country and in our state.
Yeah.
So, I feel we have to get a firm control over our election systems, get rid of the stupid voting machines that are connected to the internet, and actually get to paper ballots, watermarked paper ballots, and voter ID. and just and keep it simple. It's old school. I know we're in a digital age, but it's the best way to make sure that there's transparency and a fair election.
Well,
Uh,
the sheriff's department, needs to be involved in our National Guard, right?
yeah,
Our militias. The state militia needs to be involved as well when it comes to safeguarding. But not just that, but also poll watching. Poll watching has always been key to ensuring that ballots are being counted properly. There's no cheating going on, and there's been oversight, right? Why? Because people are getting scrutinized to making sure, they're not interfering with the counting, but they're watching, they're filming, they're observing, and they're reporting to making sure. Well, this is why, when you go back to the 2020 election, why certain towns and cities and states were like blocking views from poll watchers. Why would you do that? It's just another form of accountability to ensure things are being done fairly. And then all of a sudden they truck in and bus in all these, other, ballots to be quote unquote counted. And then nobody could see how the counting was being done. I mean, it's again, it's easy to see when there's cheating, but there's people who don't want to believe that. I always get well, why would they want to, cheat? Why would they do that? Right? The corrupting government, and people have a really hard time thinking their own government, would ever attack their own people. And this is exactly what we're enduring. So yeah, it's key when it comes to our the integrity of our elections. But people have to want to get involved. And look what happened with Prop 50. I mean, Prop 50, it was illegal. When you look at the California state constitution, they had no authority to even attempt to put it on a proposition because they had to go to the commission, right? So the public committee was who our legislative body needed to go to even ask if they could draft new lines and propose if they could submit for redistricting, right? And the committee basically said no. And then they said, well, we're going to put it on as an initiative. No, then you just violated the state constitution. It's literally written right in there as to who has say over that. And so they wanted the people to decide on that, and they based it off of the amount of hatred they could get for Trump, blaming Trump for what was happening with Texas. And like it was just, I mean, yeah, it was a beautifully done on the left, gaslighting everybody, but most people had no clue. Really, like even a relative of mine who works in law enforcement was like, I don't understand this. What am I missing? So even law enforcement was like, should I vote no or should I vote yes? Like, how does this benefit me? Or is it bad and it's really going to be bad for the state? Like, I don't know enough about this. Like, people were really, unsure. So a huge chunk of people just didn't even vote because for them it was too confusing and they were just inundated. And now here we are. Again, this is why I tell people if you read the California State Constitution, you would have already known immediately that when that proposition came out, that prop shouldn't even been on the table because the state constitution already has a committee that we voted on twice. That committee, that public committee, would be the deciding factor as to when district redistricting could occur, and usually it's in line with federal elections to ensure that things are balanced. Because again, there's numerous court cases that deal with a majority and a minority of states interacting at the federal level that would force at one time it was like the federal government was pushing so hard that the minority of states were overrun, and then there was no power, there was no balance of power and stuff. So then it'd be switched where it was like the minority states were pushing so much that they were overrunning the majority of the people. So there is a design factor to ensure that there is an equality. So now California is not just a super majority, but now they're going to be a mega majority. So who represents the minority now in the state of California from a different party? There is none. So technically, in some part, I guess you could look at it as a positive. There's no party. It's just everyone's a Democrat. Okay, well then I guess I'll run the Democrat ticket, right? Because
yeah,
what's the point of running on the R ticket? You guys have wiped it out. So I guess we're all Democrats now, right? So that in some part, that's a good thing because now you're forced to look at the nature of the character of the candidate, and irrelevant if they have a D now. So this is where
right.
we're at. This is why I'm saying we've got a bunch of geniuses in office that are constantly trying to reinvent the wheel, and they just show their ineptitude on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to share before we end this episode, where people can find you. You have a great website, danielforcalgovernor.com. And I just wanted to click on this here on your biography. I was looking at it earlier today, just kind of getting to know your background. I encourage our viewership to also check this out. He has a great story of how his family, his grandparents immigrated during World War II to America, and talks about his time serving in our U.S. military. And down here, I read something else. There was something that you said about let's see, why Daniel. Oh, this is what I liked about when I was reading. It says here, this coup d'etat must be stopped. When you enlist into the military, you swear an oath to support and defend the United States Constitution first. You do not swear to support and defend the New World Order. You do not swear an oath to defend any one party, such as Republican or Democrat. We are losing our constitutional foundation to the technocrats who are using the socialist, Marxist, and communistic tactics to bring down our country one state at a time. Gavin Newsom and many of our state legislators on both sides of the fence are part of this threat. This is not conspiracy, it's fact. And even if it were conspiracy, it doesn't make it any less true. That was very well said. And I think that's a great way to kind of conclude this show. I encourage folks to follow your website, donate to your campaign, to your campaign. I think you definitely have a great vision for the future of California,
Thank you.
taking a constitutional approach, and that's something that is nonpartisan. People on all sides of the political spectrum can get behind working with leaders in our country and state that are constitutionalists. I think that there's something in the Constitution for everybody. It can serve all of the people of a culture and of a state. I also encourage our viewers to follow you on social media, on your Instagram. I think where else do you post? You post on X as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. If you go on the website, you can see all my social media platforms. I think it's X, YouTube, Rumble, um, X, Facebook, Instagram, and Truth Social. So,
Awesome.
and honestly, it gets really hard to kind of keep up with all of them. I have a social media manager, but I usually do first most of the posts, then she kind of handles and moves, tries to connect people to my platform. So, and every day I'm growing. I get anywhere from 1 to 5 new followers on one of those platforms regularly. So that's good. I actually have organic growth, which is, a lot of people are like, wow, well, you got to get 50,000 more or whatever, because some of the other candidates have that. But some of the other candidates don't actually have, they have, if you look at the back end, you can see that they have kind of a block growth where it looks like steps. Those aren't actual real followers. If you look at somebody who has a granule growth that looks like a rainbow and it curves, that's a granule growth of actual real organic followers. And so that's what I have. But yeah,
Yeah.
everybody can find me there. Pick
Well,
at
I
my
definitely,
videos, share my videos,
yep. And
and I
also,
have TikTok.
oh, TikTok too. Yeah, that's right. For the Gen Zs that are out
I
there, you got
the
to
Gen
follow
Zs, I got
TikTok.
TikTok for you.
Right. And then you also post all of your flyers for upcoming speaking engagements, which I think is great for people in California to actually go to these events because, I mean, it's one thing to see things on a screen, but, with the digital stuff and the AI, it's like we need to get back to like seeing people in a live forum for who they are. And it looks like you have an event coming up January 10th, 2026. Patriots for Freedom Club presents Crosstalk Gubernatorial Forum, and that's going to be held, like I said, January 10th, 2026 at the Calvary Chapel, West Grove. That's at
Yes.
12832 Knott Street in the city of Garden Grove, California. Doors open at 2 p.m., starting time 3 to 6:30. And it looks like we have Steve Hilton joining you as well, Daniel. We have Louis Herms, David Serpa, and Sheriff Chad Bianco. So it seems like you guys are probably some of the front runners of the gubernatorial race. So this would be a great event for people to attend.
Yeah, this was really set out to try to put together top grassroots, top establishment picks next to each other. Who's making the most noise? And there's been a few other candidates that have called that have been turned away. I think some of the other gubernatorial candidates, Greta Solorzano, I think Jim Athens, Tim Hay, I think Che On has actually called to the moderator to PFF, and they said no. And of course, they were upset because they were like, "Why not?" And the answer was is because, well, the amount of noise that a candidate should be making by this time, should be greatly increased. And people are like, "Well, why is Daniel out there?" Well, Daniel's been out there for 6.5 years, so he's kind of a thorn in everyone's side. So he's definitely made his rounds. His name is known even among the establishment picks. They know who I am. And when I get to other forums, even with Democrats, they come up to me and they say, "Yeah, man, I've been checking you out for quite some time." I don't check out other candidates. I don't go on other candidates' websites. I even had a private meeting with Steve, Chad, and a couple other candidates, and they were like, "Oh yeah, I've been on all your websites. I've watched a lot of your videos, Daniel." I was like, "Really?" Because I haven't watched any of yours. I know
Well,
people say you got to check out the competition. I don't.
yeah, I just think it's
I,
because
I
you are
focus on my
very
campaign.
well, you're extremely qualified, Daniel. You're a great candidate. You're very well researched. You're a constitutionalist. You've read both our U.S. Constitution as well as the state constitution. I honestly feel it's your God-given gift and it resonates with you. And so that's why it comes so natural to who you are. And I
Thank
definitely
you.
think that, I mean, yes, it is a David and Goliath situation from our
Oh
perspective at
yeah.
this point in time, because it's not just the Democrats or other people that you're running against. It's the state GOP. It's there's so
Yes.
many layers to the onion, and so please
Yes.
don't let that discourage you. Continue to stay the course because I mean people resonate with you, Daniel, and I'm just honored that you
Thank
made the
you.
time to come on our show today on the Ultra MK podcast, where together we are reversing the narrative. I'm your host, Matt Kennedy. Daniel Mercury, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you
Uh,
again for letting me speak to your audience.
Absolutely. And I can't wait to see you again, and we'll be in touch.